You know those stories that sound like something straight out of a Hollywood movie? Well, this one is even crazier because it's real. Tim Sears was just a regular guy, like you and me, enjoying his vacation on a cruise. But fate had other plans for him that night. And you know what's terrifying? While you're here, safe, watching this video, people are falling off ships and no one notices. That's right. And that's exactly what happened to Tim. What I'm about to tell you will make you think twice before leaning over a ship's railing. And here's the thing. There's one detail in this story that no one has been able to explain to this day. How does someone survive 12 hours in the open ocean, completely alone, with no safety equipment? Take a deep breath, because this story will leave you gasping. Man, let me tell you about Tim Sears. Picture a 31-year-old American, the kind of guy everyone knows. Works all week just so he can go all out on the weekend. You know that friend who's always the life of the party? That was Tim. 2005 had been a rough year for him. One of those years you just want to forget, you know? And what's the best way to turn things around? A party. Tim and his best friend decided to do something wild. Book a Caribbean cruise on the Celebration. And man, what a ship. It looked like a floating resort. Imagine this. Insane pools. A sparkling casino, music blasting 24/7. It was literally a city in the middle of the ocean. Colorful drinks never stopped coming. People were dancing like there was no tomorrow. That vacation vibe that makes you forget all your problems, you know? Dude, this is gonna be the best week of my life, Tim told his friend as they checked in. Little did he know how ironic that sentence would become. And you know what's even crazier? That day started like any other day on the cruise. Tim woke up late, had breakfast on the balcony looking at the ocean, which would later become his worst nightmare, then went straight to the pool. Drinks were flowing, everything was perfect. At night, Tim got dressed for dinner. He put on his best outfit, that Hawaiian shirt, totally Caribbean vibes, and went to meet up with the friends he'd made on the ship. Tonight's gonna be wild. He posted on social media. It was his last message before, well, you won't believe what happened next. The night was just getting started. The casino was buzzing, poker chips clinking on the tables, and Tim, still rocking that Hawaiian shirt he'd picked out so carefully, was tearing up the dance floor. Well, tearing up might be a stretch. More like that goofy, uncoordinated dancing of someone who's had one too many drinks, you know? Between songs, Tim realized his friend had disappeared. I'll just check the cabin real quick, he thought, trying to steady himself as he walked through the hallway. The ship swayed gently, or was he the one stumbling? Reaching his cabin's balcony, Tim leaned against the railing to get some air. And this, my friends, is where things get terrifying. He was 3 or 4 stories high. Can you imagine? The impact of hitting the water from that height is like slamming into concrete. Most people don't survive a fall like that. But with Tim, well, it was different. Splash! Imagine this. 1 second, you're standing, and the next, the ground disappears. Tim didn't even have time to scream. The fall was so fast that it felt like an eternity. The rushing wind, the ship's lights turning into a blur, and then impact. You know that feeling when you wake up from a nightmare, drenched in sweat, heart pounding? Now multiply that by 1,000. Tim opened his eyes to what seemed like the most terrifying scene possible. It wasn't his bed, it wasn't even the floor of the ship, it was water, water everywhere. The first thing he felt was the violent cold shock, the kind that steals your breath, makes your muscles lock up. Then came the bitter taste of salt water flooding his mouth, burning his nose, and then pure panic, that raw, primal fear that makes your whole body shake. The ship, that floating city full of lights and music, was now a silent giant drifting away into the darkness. Picture an ant on a massive black carpet. That's how small a person looks in the ocean during the day. Now imagine that same ant. At night, it's almost impossible to see. "Hey! Help!" Tim screamed until his throat burned. But you know what's even worse? The music from the ship kept playing in the distance. People were dancing, laughing, drinking, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding in the dark waters below. Have you ever felt alone? Like, truly alone? Now, imagine this. You, floating in the middle of the ocean, where the water is so dark you can't even see your own hands. Below you, miles of deep, open sea. Around you, miles of water in every direction. The cold creeping into your bones, the waves slamming into your face, and that terrifying question pounding in your head. Will anyone even realize I fell? The craziest part? Tim had survived a fall that should have been fatal. It was like the universe had given him a second chance, but with a warning. You survived the fall, kid. But now, the real fight for survival is just beginning. And while Tim was fighting for his life in the dark waters, do you know what was happening up on the Celebration? Life went on. Its blood-curdling, bartenders were still serving colorful drinks with tiny umbrellas. People were dancing in the nightclub. Couples were strolling along the deck under the stars, maybe even looking at the very same ocean where Tim was. Completely unaware, Tim's friend probably assumed he had met someone, or was off enjoying the night somewhere on the ship. I mean, what's the first thing you think when you can't find a friend at a party? Oh, they must be around somewhere. And you know what's truly terrifying? This happens more often than you'd think. Every year, people fall off cruise ships, and no one notices. It's like they just vanish. Meanwhile, the crew kept doing their jobs as usual. Checking cabins, serving drinks, organizing activities for the next day. A normal day in paradise, while a nightmare was unfolding just a few meters below. Have you ever tried floating in a pool for 10 minutes? It gets exhausting, doesn't it? Now imagine doing that in the open ocean. For hours, in the dark, alone. Tim kept swimming frantically. But where to? At night, every direction looks the same. It was just him. The sound of the waves and darkness that felt endless. And the cold. Oh, the cold. You know that warm, tropical Caribbean temperature that everyone loves? Well, at night, it's a different story. I have to keep swimming. I have to keep swimming. Tim repeated to himself like a mantra. His muscles burned from exhaustion. The salt water had cracked his lips and turned his throat raw, and here's a fact most people don't know. The Caribbean Sea, which feels warm during the day, can drop to temperatures that make your body tremble uncontrollably at night. It's like thousands of tiny ice needles stabbing your skin. Hypothermia creeps in, slowly, sneaky. First, you shiver. Then, your fingers go numb. And then, well, better not even think about what comes next. Every wave that crashed against Tim's face was a new challenge. Every accidental gulp of salt water was a new torture. And time? Time felt frozen. Minutes dragged on like hours. Has anyone realized I fell? Is someone sending a rescue team? How much longer until sunrise? Those questions kept hammering in his mind as he fought to keep his nose above water. Finally, the night gave way to the first faint orange rays of the sun on the horizon. You know that relief you feel when the sun rises? Well, for Tim, the morning light brought an even crueler reality. The darkness of the night had been terrifying, but at least it hid what Tim was about to realize. Nothing, absolutely nothing around him. No land, no ships, no birds, just a gigantic, endless circle of blue stretching as far as the eye could see. For the first time, Tim could fully grasp his situation. And man, it was devastating. Imagine this. You're just a tiny speck in the middle of the largest ocean in the world. The waves, which seemed big at night, now looked like towering mountains of water. My God, where am I? He whispered to himself, his voice hoarse from screaming for help all night. The sun, now rising, reflected on the water like thousands of tiny mirrors, almost blinding him. Was it beautiful? Sure, but it was the kind of beauty that makes you realize just how small and insignificant you are. And then came another terrifying thought. You know those shark stories we always hear? Well, now that it was light, every shadow in the water, every tiny movement beneath him, made Tim's heart race, because this was their territory. And there, in the middle of that vast blue abyss, Tim started having the strangest conversations. With himself. Between each desperate stroke, memories flooded his mind. His mother's smile as she made those special Sunday breakfasts. His little brother's annoying laugh, which now seemed like the most precious sound in the world. Even that stupid fight with his ex-girlfriend over a TV remote suddenly felt so meaningless. His arms felt like they weighed a ton. His legs? Completely numb hours ago, but every memory was like a shot of adrenaline straight to his heart. If I make it out of this, Tim thought as he swallowed another mouthful of salt water, I'll never complain about Mondays again. And you know what's amazing? The human brain is a survival machine. Right there, in the middle of nowhere, Tim started making plans. Plans! When I get back, I'll ask for that promotion. I'll make amends with Jim. I'll finally learn to play the guitar. It was as if each future plan was an invisible rope pulling him forward, keeping him from giving up. And so, between delirium from salt water and promises for the future, Tim kept going, one stroke, another, and another. Because deep down, something told him this couldn't be his last story to tell. After nearly 12 hours in the water, his arms felt like lead, his legs barely responded, and his mind was starting to play tricks on him. And then it happened. At first, he thought it was another hallucination. After all, after drinking so much salt water, seeing things that aren't there is pretty common. But no, there was something on the horizon. A dark shape, bigger than the waves. Tim's heart, already exhausted, started pounding even harder. It was a ship, a huge cargo ship, the kind that looks like a floating skyscraper. The name Annie was stamped on its side, like a glowing sign of salvation. "Help! Here! Please!" Tim screamed with what little strength he had left. His voice was hoarse and broken, barely coming out. 12 hours of swallowing salt water had turned his throat into a desert. And then, my friends, something happened that can only be called a miracle. One of the crew members on the Annie, later identified as Mr. Rodriguez, a veteran sailor, was doing his usual rounds when— wait, was that a scream? You know that feeling when you need something to happen, more than anything in the world. Tim had used his last ounce of energy on those screams. If it didn't work, well, better not even think about that. What happened in the next few minutes felt like a scene straight out of a movie. The Annie's crew went into full rescue mode. Ropes were thrown. Rescue boats were deployed. Tim, with the last remnants of his strength, managed to grab the rope they threw. When they finally hauled him onto the ship's deck, Tim collapsed. His fingers were so wrinkled they looked like raisins. His lips were turning blue from the cold. His whole body was trembling uncontrollably. But he was alive. "I've never seen anything like this," the Annie's captain later said. "In 30 years at sea, I've heard survival stories. But 12 hours? Alone? Without a life jacket? It's practically impossible." The crew acted quickly. Thermal blankets, fresh, water, this time no salt, and emergency medical care. Tim was dehydrated, exhausted, and on the verge of hypothermia. But other than that, he was a walking miracle. And you know what he said when he finally managed to speak? "Can I use your phone? My mom must be worried." Classic, right? After surviving the impossible, his first concern was making sure no one else was worried about him. Meanwhile, back on the Celebration, do you know when they finally realized Tim was missing? Only when the ship docked. That's right. Let that sink in. Tim was gone for 12 hours before anyone even noticed. Isn't that absolutely chilling? How does someone just disappear from a ship and no one notices? Tim's friend had assumed he was just somewhere on board having fun. The crew had no protocol for checking whether all passengers were on board during the night. It was as if Tim had fallen into a black hole. When news of the rescue reached the Celebration, the reaction was pure shock. Wait, he spent 12 hours in the ocean? How did no one see? How did no one hear anything? Questions started flying, and with them, serious concerns about cruise ship safety. And here's the scary part. Tim's case isn't as rare as you might think. Every year, people fall off cruise ships. Some are rescued. Others, well, you can imagine. The statistics are disturbing. Most overboard incidents end in tragedy. Why? Because it's nearly impossible to spot someone in the water, especially at night. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of the ocean. After Tim's case, cruise companies started implementing new safety measures. Thermal cameras, motion sensors, stricter protocols. But even so, the question remains, is it enough? Tim decided to turn his experience into something positive. He started giving talks about survival, resilience, and the importance of never giving up. "Every second in that water taught me something about life," he often says. His story became a symbol of hope, because if a regular guy with no special training managed to survive 12 hours in the ocean, what else are we capable of when we really have to fight for our lives? Tim's story made headlines worldwide. Newspapers, magazines, TV shows. Everyone wanted to know, how did he do it? What went through his mind during those endless 12 hours? But more than that, his survival became a symbol of human strength. At a time when bad news seems to dominate, stories like Tim's remind us that miracles happen, that the human spirit is stronger than we think. Tim always says he learned more in those 12 hours than in his entire life. When you're alone in the middle of the ocean, your priorities become very clear, he says in his talks. And the most important lesson? Never, ever give up. No matter how impossible the situation seems, as long as there's life, there's hope, and sometimes all it takes is one more stroke, one more scream, one more moment of resistance for a miracle to happen. And you? What would you do if you were in Tim's place? How would you react if you woke up alone, in the middle of the ocean, not knowing if anyone was coming to save you? I've had moments in life when I felt like giving up. But you know what? Tim's story makes us think about our own inner strength and reminds us that sometimes our limits are far beyond what we imagine. Oh, and that Hawaiian shirt Tim was wearing the night he fell? He still has it, framed on his wall. A daily reminder that every day is a gift, a second chance that not everyone is lucky enough to get. And if you liked this story, don't forget to share, subscribe, and leave a like to help the channel grow. Oh, and there's another crazy sea story popping up on your screen right now. Big hug, and see you in the next sea story.